A black man walks through a white neighborhood. He's not armed. He's not yelling. He's just walking. 2 blocks later, he's in handcuffs. Turns out, he's the chief of police. So what exactly was the crime? His footsteps or his skin? He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was just walking down a sidewalk lined with hydrangeas and American flags, in a neighborhood still flinched when a black man wore confidence like a tailored shirt. The officer saw him from half a block away and knew, or thought he knew, that something was off. No one said it aloud anymore, but skin still spoke louder than behavior in places like this. No matter the shoes, no matter the silence. What happened next wasn't about the law. It was about perception, and a badge too quick to assume. The man's name? You'll want to remember it, because the man they cuffed didn't just belong on that street. He ran the precinct that policed it. Savannah, Georgia, present day and 1969, echoing beneath every step. Alex Reyes didn't wear his badge that day. He wore khaki pants, a pale blue shirt, sleeves rolled up, and a pair of quiet leather loafers, the kind of clothing that promised no threat, offered no explanation. He had just left his mother's house on the east side of Savannah, the same house she'd cleaned every morning since the Nixon years, like it still needed to prove something to the neighbors who'd never come inside. Crossing into the historic district was only 6 blocks on paper. But in Savannah, some lines aren't drawn by streets. They're drawn by history. The houses grew larger. The air is quieter. Wind chimes whispered from porches wrapped in American flags and magnolia leaves. And brown-skinned, calm, walking alone became something to notice. Not because he did anything, but because he existed where some believed he shouldn't. He felt the cruiser before he saw it. Slow and deliberate, it rolled behind him like Maya Emery wearing a uniform. The officer was young and white, with the posture that comes from being told he belonged everywhere. He pulled up without lights, without sirens, just silence. "Sir, can I help you with something?" Alex turned, slow and steady. The street around them was empty except for trimmed lawns and suspicion. "I'm heading home," he said, voice flat. "You live around here?" There it was. The question didn't surprise him. It never had. It had simply waited. Because Alex remembered the first time it was asked. Savannah, 1969. He was 7. He held his mother's hand and walked behind his father on a warm Sunday afternoon. His shoes tapped softly on the pavement. His mother, pregnant with his baby brother, walked slower that day, one hand pressed gently to her belly. They said his father, Ernesto, had parked outside a hardware store on the wrong side of town. Brown skin didn't go with brick facades and fine storefronts. The officers didn't ask for ID. They didn't ask anything. They slammed him against the wall like labor couldn't earn respect. His father didn't fight. He only looked back and said, "Stay with your mother." She didn't stay. She stepped off the curb barefoot, yelling in Spanish. That mattered. The language, the fear, the refusal to keep silent. One officer turned, hand on his belt. Alex felt her grip tighten on his shoulder. She pulled him into her belly, pressed his head where he couldn't see, but he still heard the thud. The breath knocked from his father's lungs, the wordless authority that always felt too certain. They let Ernesto go 10 minutes later. There was no arrest, no apology, just a warning. Not your neighborhood. Now, 50 years later, Alex stood on that same street and asked the same question. "You live around here?" He smiled, thin, without humor, just recognition. "I do," he said. "The better question is, do you?" The officer blinked. Somewhere behind a curtain, someone was watching. Somewhere beneath the soles of his shoes, Alex could feel the brick wall still humming with memory. And history waited. The young officer's hand lingered near his belt, not gripping anything yet, but the gesture was enough. It was the kind of movement that meant nothing to those who didn't know, and everything to those who did. Alex Reyes knew. He had trained men like this, had signed off on their psychological profiles, had read their names on reports that used words like reasonable suspicion and non-compliant body language. He took a slow breath, not because he was afraid, but because memory sometimes demands patience. "I'd still like to see some ID," the officer said, a little firmer now. Alex kept his voice even. "Am I being detained?" The question cut through the summer air with more force than a siren. "No, sir," the officer replied quickly, like he'd been coached. "Just asking routine questions." "Routine for who?" Alex asked. "People walking? Or people who look like me walking?" The officer shifted his weight. Behind him, the cruiser loomed like an unspoken threat. The sidewalk, the houses, and the hydrangeas seemed to hold their breath. "I've asked you politely," the officer said, tone tightening. "You're refusing to identify yourself, and that it's not a crime," Alex interrupted. "Georgia is not a stop-and-ID state unless you reasonably suspect a crime has been committed. Walking in daylight doesn't qualify." Now the officer blinked. The shift was subtle. His posture didn't change, but his confidence cracked slightly, like a windshield chipped by a pebble at 70 miles an hour. Alex looked at him, not in challenge, but in study, like a professor observing a student who had memorized the rules but never understood their meaning. "I asked if you live around here," the officer said again, but this time it sounded less like a question and more like a crutch. Alex let the silence stretch, filling the space between them with every story ending in silence or sirens. Then, finally, he reached into his back pocket. Slow, deliberate, opened a leather case. He didn't flash it. He held it out gently. Inside, a gold badge. Not a patrolman's shield. Not a city cop's token, but a chief's insignia. Savannah Metro Police. Chief A. Reyes. The young officer's throat bobbed. His eyes scanned it twice. Then a third time. I didn't recognize you," he muttered. Alex nodded once. "You weren't looking to." No venom, no anger, just the truth, polished and simple. "I'm not going to write you up," Alex continued. "You didn't draw your weapon. You didn't escalate." He paused. "But you did presume. And that's the kind of thing that grows, son. Quietly. Like mold. Like rot." The cruiser sat still. The sun beat down. "I want you in my office tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock sharp. We'll talk about how you see this city and who you think it belongs to." Then Alex turned and walked away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't turn back. But in that silence, the lesson had already begun. Officer Nate Halley sat behind the wheel of his cruiser for almost 10 whole minutes before he realized he hadn't moved. The sun still hung hot in the sky, but something colder had settled behind his ribs. He could hear the breeze in the trees, the faint clink of a wind chime across the street. Every sound now felt louder, or maybe it was just the quiet in his head that made them ring. He replayed the conversation repeatedly, his tone, the way he'd stood, how he'd said, routine. What stung most wasn't that he'd made a mistake. It was that he hadn't known he was making one. That's the part no one tells you about. The kind of prejudice that whispers, not shouts. The kind that gets passed down in looks, not lectures. He stared at the name inside the leather folio. Chief A. Reyes. He'd heard the name during orientation. Knew the man was respected. He knew he had a record of reform and of leading with principle. But when he saw him on the street in plain clothes, alone, brown, none of that registered. Nate swallowed hard and shifted to his seat. Why didn't I see him? Meanwhile, Alex Reyes sat alone at his mother's kitchen table 3 blocks away, the same Formica surface he'd eaten sandwiches on as a child, the exact spot where he'd watched his father sit after the wall, after the cops, after that day in 1969. Ernesto had come home with scraped knuckles and quiet eyes. He didn't yell, didn't curse. He kissed Lucia's swollen belly, ruffled Alex's hair, and took his shoes off like any other Sunday. That silence had confused Alex for years. Why hadn't his father fought back, demanded justice? It wasn't until years later, after Yale, after the academy, after sitting in rooms where policy was shaped, that Alex understood. His father hadn't been quiet because he was weak. He had been silent because he chose to live, because survival was resistance, because dignity, when denied, becomes sacred. Alex leaned back in the kitchen chair, feeling the memory settle in the walls. He wondered if the young officer would show up tomorrow. Part of him doubted it. Another part, the part raised by Ernesto, hoped he would. Not for punishment, but for understanding. Because some lessons don't need handcuffs or headlines, they need a room. A pause. A man willing to stand before what he almost became and say, I didn't see you, but now I do. Outside, the sky began to shift into that honeyed southern dusk, and 2 men, on 2 sides of a story, sat silently, each beginning, finally, to listen. At 8:47 a.m., Alex Reyes unlocked the side door to the community hall. The folding chairs hadn't been set up. The coffee hadn't brewed. He hadn't planned to ask for help. But Officer Nate Halley was already inside. There was no uniform, no badge, just a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. He was quietly moving chairs, lining them up in even rows. On the side table were bottled water, printed handouts, and extra copies of Alex's materials arranged carefully. It was a small act, but done with both hands. Alex paused in the doorway. You lost? He asked, not cold, but soft. Nate looked up, nervous but grounded. No, sir. Thought I'd come early. Least I could do. Alex didn't answer, just watched him finish setting the last row. When the students began arriving, black, Latino, and a few white kids from the east side, they took their seats in that quiet way teenagers do when they're unsure what the day will ask of them. Alex didn't walk to the podium. He walked among them. I'm not here to impress you, he said. I'm here to talk about what it means to be seen. He told them about 1969, the wall, the sweat on his father's face. His pregnant mother was barefoot on hot pavement. The lesson he carried wasn't about anger. It was about what kind of man you become after someone refuses to see you as one. Midway through, Alex turned toward the back of the room. Officer Halley, he said, still with us? Nate nodded. Quiet. Alex gestured. Come speak. Not as a cop, as a person. Nate walked up slowly. His voice was low but steady. I misjudged someone, based on skin, shirt, and silence. I didn't see the man. I saw what I was taught to fear. He glanced at the teens, most staring at him like they were unsure if this was real. And I'm sorry, he said, not just to the chief, but to anyone who's ever had to make themselves smaller to feel safe near someone like me. The room held its breath. Nate stepped back. "I'll be here next week, too. If there are chairs to move, I'll move them. If there's water to pour, I'll pour it." Alex nodded. "Good. Humility is heavier than a badge. Carry it well." Then he turned back to the students. "Let me ask you this," he said, eyes scanning the room. "What makes us feel safe? Someone's uniform or character?" A long silence followed. Then slowly, hands began to rise, not in answer, but in recognition. And somewhere in that moment, the weight in the room began to shift, from history to hope. Marcus didn't clap when the others did, not because he disagreed or because he wasn't moved, but because clapping felt too easy, too sudden, like trying to summarize something that hadn't finished moving inside him yet. He sat in the back row, hoodie sleeves pulled over his hands, back straight, face blank. It was the same posture he wore every time he walked through a metal detector, whenever someone locked their car door at a red light, and when they saw him standing nearby. He had learned how to fold himself into the corners of the world without being noticed. But today, he had been seen. He hadn't expected much when he showed up that morning. Another leadership program, another adult with too many words and not enough time to mean them. He came because his mother asked him to, because she had worked 2 jobs and was still worried about where he might be after school. But then Chief Reyes spoke. Not like a cop, not like a politician, but like someone who still remembered what the sidewalk felt like under small feet, like someone who had once looked up at a man with a badge and thought, "Please don't." When that white officer, Hallie, stood up and apologized, it cracked something open that Marcus didn't know he'd been holding. Not because it fixed anything, but someone like that was still willing to stay in the room after being harmed. After the session ended, the room began to empty in waves, some students laughing, some quiet, a few already scrolling on their phones. Marcus stayed seated. He watched Hallie stack the chairs he had unstacked that morning, moving without needing to be watched. Alex came over but didn't say anything at first, just sat in the chair beside him. "You okay?" Alex finally asked. Marcus nodded, then shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "That's an honest answer." They sat in silence, the kind that lets truth settle where it's safe. Then Marcus asked, "Do you think he meant it? The apology?" Alex looked at him, not surprised by the question, but careful with the answer. "I think he showed up. I think he stayed. And I think he worked." Marcus nodded again, slowly, the way people do when they want to believe something but aren't sure how yet. Alex studied him. "You've got a lot in your chest," he said gently. "You don't have to say it now, but someday you might want to say it somewhere." Marcus's eyes dropped. "I don't talk much." "You don't have to talk loud," Alex said. "You just have to speak the truth." There was a long beat. Then Marcus looked up. "Would you let me come back next week? Not as a student. To help." Alex smiled, small but deep. "We'd be lucky to have you." As Marcus walked toward the door, he paused. The room was empty now, the light softer, the chairs all stacked. He didn't turn back, but his voice carried. What if the loudest way to lead is to choose not to leave? Alex didn't answer. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be lived. The room was quiet now. The chairs were stacked. The lights were off. The door clicked shut behind the last student. And still, Alex Reyes remained. He sat alone in the front row, elbows resting on his knees, hands laced together, not in fatigue, but in reflection. He had spoken. They had listened. And yet, what stayed with him wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. He could still see Marcus pausing at the door, asking that final question without turning around. What if the loudest way to lead is to choose not to leave? It lingered, like the last note of a hymn in an old church, echoing long after the pews were empty. Alex let the words settle into his chest. He thought of his father. Ernesto never stood in front of a classroom. He never wrote speeches or gave interviews, but he led in the way he folded his work shirt each night, in the way he kissed his wife's temple after a long shift, in the way he looked at 7-year-old Alex that Sunday in 1969, blood on his lip, back against a brick wall, and said nothing, because he knew his son would remember it all. He thought of Nate Halley, still new to the weight of his own mistakes, still learning how to show up without a shield. But today, he hadn't run. He hadn't asked to be excused. He'd moved chairs, poured water, and owned up to his fault in front of strangers. That counted for something. Alex had known many men who wore badges for decades and never learned to do that. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched longer across the sidewalk. Shadows fell in the same places they always did, but somehow they felt softer today, as if even the trees knew something had shifted. Alex stood and took one last look at the room, not as a commander, but as a witness to what had been said, to those who had shown up, and to the silences that now spoke louder than lectures. On the whiteboard behind him, someone had left a note. It wasn't signed, just 6 words. "Thank you for seeing us whole." He read it once, then twice, not for validation, but for grounding. Outside, the world had not changed, not yet. There would still be headlines, still in pain. There are still moments when walking while black, or brown, or simply different, might draw suspicion before recognition. But here, in this room, today, someone stood. Someone stayed. Someone saw. That was enough for now. Because movements don't begin with masses, they start with moments. With a boy in the back row, with a cop stacking chairs, with a man who carried his father's silence all his life and chose to turn it into speech. Alex stepped outside. He didn't close the door all the way. Some spaces are meant to remain open. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell you because some memories will repeat themselves if we don't discuss them. I was once the boy holding my mother's belly as my father was slammed against a wall. I was once the man in a pale shirt who was questioned on the street. I was sworn to protect. And today, I stay, not to retaliate, but to ask a question. When you look at me, who do you see? A threat, or a person, a citizen, or a shadow shaped by someone else's fear? That young officer chose to stay. And in that moment, I believed, we don't have to change the world overnight. We just have to change the way we see each other. If this story made you pause, don't scroll away in silence. Don't forget to share and subscribe to our channel for more upcoming videos.